47 caretakers had already failed. Nora Webb read the number again on the glowing screen of the employment terminal, wondering if it was a typo. It was not. The job listing for the Vithrani Imperial Palace had been posted and removed and posted again so many times that the system had flagged it as potentially fraudulent. But the salary was real. The danger was also real. The Vithrani were a reptilian species that ruled one of the largest empires in the known galaxy. They breathed fire. They lived for 300 years. They considered most other species to be either allies or food, with very little middle ground. And their emperor had 3 young children who had driven away every single caretaker sent to manage them. Nora leaned back in her chair at the employment office on Orbital Station 12. She was tired. Earth had sent her into space 5 years ago as part of a cultural exchange program, and she had spent those years working in xenobiological pediatrics. She had treated young Felrani who could spray acid when frightened. She had calmed infant Boraki whose natural defense was to emit a sound that caused temporary paralysis. She had even spent 6 months on a Krellian colony, where the children had venomous spines. But Vithrani hatchlings were different. They were apex predators from birth. Their fire could melt steel. Their claws could tear through armor. And according to the reports Nora was reading, the 3 royal children had hospitalized 11 caretakers, traumatized 23 others, and caused one to simply disappear without explanation. The employment officer, a thin insectoid named Brevis, clicked his mandibles nervously. He had been trying to fill this position for 8 months. Nobody wanted it. The Vithrani Emperor had threatened to close his borders to the Galactic Union if they could not provide adequate help. This was a diplomatic crisis disguised as a childcare problem. Nora asked about the children. Brevis pulled up their files with obvious reluctance. Pyrrhus was 4 years old, female, highly intelligent, and had learned to use her fire breath with strategic precision. She was the ringleader. Solon was 3 years old, male, physically the strongest of the 3, and prone to destructive tantrums that had required the nursery to be rebuilt 17 times. Lys was 2 years old, female, and appeared innocent until you realized she was the one manipulating her siblings into chaos. Their mother had died giving birth to Lys. Their father, Emperor Dravos Kel IV, had withdrawn into his duties and left their care to servants. The children had responded by becoming ungovernable. Nora understood something in that moment that the file did not say directly. These were not monster children. These were grieving children. They were testing every adult who came near them, pushing until someone proved they would not leave. And every caretaker had left. Every single one. She told Brevis she would take the job. The insectoid stared at her with all 6 eyes. He asked if she understood what she was agreeing to. Nora said she did. Brevis asked if she had any special training in Vithrani psychology. Nora admitted she did not, but she had raised 3 younger siblings on a farm in Nebraska, and she had once convinced a feral dog to let her treat its wounds. She figured dragon children could not be much harder. Brevis processed her application with trembling appendages. He made her sign 17 different liability waivers. He gave her a fireproof suit and a translation implant. He booked her transport to the planet Ashfall, where the Vithrani Empire made its home among volcanoes and rivers of molten rock. The journey took 4 days. Nora spent that time reading everything she could find about Vithrani culture. She learned that they valued strength above all else. They respected those who did not show fear. Their hatchlings were born with instincts to test dominance, to push against boundaries, to find out who was predator and who was prey. Every previous caretaker had made the same mistake. They had tried to control the children through authority or through submission. The ones who tried authority had been burned. The ones who tried submission had been dismissed as weak. Neither approach worked because Vithrani hatchlings did not respond to either. Nora had a different idea. She would not try to dominate them or serve them. She would simply exist alongside them. She would be unimpressed by their fire. She would be unbothered by their tantrums. She would treat them like what they were, which was scared little kids with too much power and not enough guidance. Her transport landed at the palace as the twin suns set over the volcanic mountains. The air smelled like sulfur and smoke. The palace itself was carved from black stone that could withstand temperatures that would melt most metals. Guards in ceremonial armor watched her with obvious skepticism. A human. They had sent a human to manage the royal heirs. Nora walked through the massive doors and into a corridor that radiated heat. A palace administrator named Bevros met her with a datapad full of rules and warnings. He was explaining the location of the medical wing when a figure came running toward them from deeper in the palace. It was a Felrani, covered in blue fur that was currently smoking in several places. The Felrani's eyes were wild with terror. It did not slow down. It did not speak. It simply ran past Nora and out the palace doors, still trailing wisps of smoke. Bevros sighed and marked something on his datapad. That was Caretaker 47. Nora was now Caretaker 48. She asked which way to the nursery. The nursery looked like a battlefield. Scorch marks covered the walls in overlapping patterns of black and gray. The furniture had been reduced to twisted metal frames. Toys lay scattered across the floor, most of them melted or shredded or both. The only light came from glowing strips along the ceiling, designed to survive temperatures that would destroy normal fixtures. Nora stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The room was large, built to accommodate growing Vethrani children who would eventually reach 8 feet tall. Right now, its occupants were much smaller. She spotted them immediately. 3 pairs of glowing eyes watching her from behind an overturned crib made of some kind of reinforced alloy. She did not approach them. She did not speak to them. Instead, Nora walked to the center of the room, sat down on the floor, and opened the container of food she had brought from the transport. It was simple earth food, a sandwich, some fruit, a bottle of water. She began eating as if she were alone in the room. The eyes behind the crib did not move. Minutes passed. Nora finished half her sandwich and started on the fruit. She could feel the heat building in the room as the hatchlings prepared their fire. They were testing her. Every other caretaker had either approached them aggressively or stood frozen with fear. Nora was doing neither. A stream of fire shot toward her feet. It was precisely aimed, meant to startle rather than harm. The flames licked at the floor centimeters from her boots. Nora glanced down, then continued eating. She did not flinch. She did not move. She simply bit into an apple and chewed. The hatchlings exchanged looks. This was new. This human was not behaving correctly. Pyrrhus emerged first. She was small by Vethrani standards, barely reaching Nora's waist, but her scales were a deep crimson that marked her as royalty. Her eyes were golden and far too intelligent for a 4-year-old of any species. She walked toward Nora with the confidence of someone who had never met a creature she could not intimidate. Nora looked at her and nodded in acknowledgement. Then she went back to eating. Pyrrhus circled her slowly. Smoke curled from the hatchling's nostrils as she prepared another blast of fire. Nora reached into her bag and pulled out a second sandwich. She held it up toward Pyrrhus without looking at her. The hatchling stopped. She had expected fear. She had expected anger. She had not expected food. Solon charged out from behind the crib. He was stockier than his sister, built for raw power rather than precision. He ran directly at Nora with his claws extended, a move that had sent several previous caretakers to the medical wing. Nora watched him come. At the last moment, she shifted her weight slightly to the left. Solon's charge missed her by a hand's width. His momentum carried him past her, and he stumbled to a stop, confused. Nora took another bite of her sandwich. She commented, casually, that his approach was too direct. A real predator would attack from an angle where the prey could not see them coming. She offered this advice in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. Solon's jaw dropped open. No one had ever critiqued his attack before. They had only screamed or run. Liz came out last. She was the smallest, barely old enough to walk steadily. Her scales were a softer pink that would darken as she aged. She looked at Nora with enormous eyes and began to cry. It was a pitiful sound, designed to trigger protective instincts in any adult Vithrani. Nora watched the performance with genuine appreciation. She told Liz it was excellent work, very convincing. She asked if Liz had been practicing long. She offered the little one a piece of fruit. Liz stopped crying immediately. Her expression shifted from fake distress to genuine confusion. Then, slowly, something like respect flickered in those young eyes. The three hatchlings sat down around Nora in a loose semicircle. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They simply watched this strange creature who was not afraid of them. Nora finished her meal and began telling them a story about an earth animal called a honey badger. It was small, she explained, much smaller than the creatures it fought, but it was fearless. It would attack anything, no matter the size. Other animals learned to leave it alone because fighting it was never worth the trouble. The hatchlings listened with growing fascination. Pyrrhus asked if humans were like honey badgers. Nora said that humans were exactly like honey badgers, small, stubborn, and absolutely unwilling to back down from anything. Administrator Bevrose watched through the security monitors in disbelief. The human had survived the first hour. She had survived the first fire attack. She was sitting in the middle of the destroyed nursery, telling stories to children who had hospitalized 11 trained professionals. He sent an urgent message to the Emperor. Something unprecedented was happening. The door to the nursery opened. Emperor Dravos Kel IV stepped inside, his massive frame filling the doorway. He was ancient by human standards, nearly 300 years old, covered in scales of deep black that absorbed light. His eyes found the human nurse sitting on the floor with his children gathered around her. Pyrrhus looked up at her father. She told him the human was staying. Her tone left no room for argument. The audience chamber was built to intimidate. Pillars of volcanic glass rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The throne was carved from a single piece of obsidian, still warm from the planet's internal heat. Emperor Dravos sat upon it like a creature born from fire itself, his advisors arrayed behind him in silent judgment. Nora stood before them in her simple fireproof uniform. She did not bow. She did not tremble. She met the Emperor's gaze directly, which caused several advisors to hiss with disapproval. Humans were considered a lesser species, soft and fragile, barely worth noticing in the grand hierarchy of galactic power. The Emperor asked how she had survived the first day. His voice was deep and ancient, carrying the weight of centuries. Nora explained her approach simply. She had not tried to fight them or flee from them. She had just been present. Children, she said, even dragon children, wanted to know if the adults around them would stay. The hatchlings had been testing everyone who entered that nursery. They needed to find someone who would not leave. An advisor scoffed. He said that Vithrani children were not like the weak offspring of other species. They were predators from birth. They required dominance, not coddling. Nora asked how well that approach had worked so far. She gestured vaguely toward the 17 times the nursery had been rebuilt. The advisor fell silent. Emperor Dravos studied her with ancient eyes. He asked about her world. Nora told him about Earth. She explained that her planet was classified as a death world by galactic standards. The gravity was crushing. The weather was violent. The other animals had spent millions of years evolving better ways to kill each other. Humans had survived all of it through stubbornness and cooperation. She told him about dogs. Once, they had been wolves, predators that could tear a human apart. Humans had looked at these dangerous creatures and decided to make them family. Now dogs slept in human beds and protected human children. She told him about horses, animals strong enough to kill with a single kick. Humans rode them into battle. She told him about cats, ambush predators who had somehow convinced humans to feed them and clean up after them. The point, Nora said, was that humans specialized in forming bonds with creatures that should logically destroy them. It was not a weakness, it was their greatest strength. The Emperor granted her 1 week to prove her methods worked. Nora returned to the nursery and implemented her plan. She did not try to control the hatchlings through punishment or reward. Instead, she gave them challenges. When Pyrrhus burned her uniform on the second day, Nora calmly changed into a new one and assigned Pyrrhus the task of organizing every toy in the nursery by size. When Solon broke a wall during a tantrum, Nora had him carry repair materials from one end of the palace to the other until his energy was spent. When Liz tried her crying trick again, Nora asked her to demonstrate different types of cries and explain which ones worked best on which species. The hatchlings were confused at first. Misbehavior was supposed to result in anger or fear or someone leaving. Instead, it resulted in more work. But the work was interesting. It challenged them. It made them think. By the third day, something shifted. The hatchlings began competing with each other to earn harder tasks. Pyrrhus wanted to organize the entire palace library. Solon wanted to carry heavier loads. Lys wanted to practice her manipulation techniques on the palace guards with Nora's supervision. Captain Ress, head of the palace guard, reported to the Emperor that property damage had decreased by 80%. The nursery had not been set on fire in 72 hours. The children were actually sleeping through the night. Nora spent her evenings in the nursery, telling stories about Earth. She told them about elephants who mourned their dead, about dolphins who saved drowning swimmers, about a gorilla named Coco who learned sign language and asked for a pet cat. The hatchlings had never heard of creatures like these. Their own culture celebrated strength and conquest. The idea that compassion could be a form of power was entirely new to them. On the fifth night, something happened that no one expected. Nora was finishing a story about wolves who adopted a lost human child when she felt a weight settle against her side. She looked down. Lys had climbed into her lap and was falling asleep there, her small claws gripping Nora's fireproof sleeve. Pyrrhus and Solon watched their sister with uncertain expressions. They had never seen her seek comfort from anyone since their mother died. Slowly, carefully, they moved closer. Solon rested his head against Nora's shoulder. Pyrrhus curled up at her feet, her tail wrapped around Nora's ankle. Emperor Dravos stood in the doorway, unseen by any of them. He watched his children sleep peacefully for the first time in 2 years. The human had been with them for 5 days. 47 caretakers had failed in months of trying. This soft, small, fragile creature from a death world had succeeded where Vithrani experts could not. He did not understand how, but he was beginning to want to learn. 1 month had transformed the nursery into something unrecognizable. The scorch marks remained on the walls, but new artwork hung beside them, drawings made by small claws dipped in heat-resistant paint. The furniture had been replaced with pieces the hatchlings helped design. A corner held a reading area where Nora told her nightly stories. Another corner was designated for controlled fire practice, with targets the children could burn without damaging anything important. The palace staff whispered about the human who had tamed the untamable. Some admired her. Others resented the idea that a lesser species could succeed where Vithrani masters had failed. The children themselves had changed. Pyrrhus still breathed fire, but now she asked permission first. Solon still had enormous strength, but he used it to carry things for the servants rather than destroy them. Lys still manipulated everyone around her, but Nora had channeled that talent into learning diplomacy and negotiation. Not everyone was pleased. Lord Cavros belonged to a noble house that had advised the throne for generations. He believed the Vithrani were the supreme species in the galaxy, and that their children should be raised to conquer, not cooperate. The human nurse was teaching the royal heir's weakness. She was corrupting their warrior spirits with alien ideas about compassion and pack bonds. Something had to be done. He found others who shared his views. They met in secret and made plans. The human would have an accident. The children would be terrified back into proper Vithrani behavior. Everything would return to the way it should be. Nora was alone with the hatchlings when the attack came. She was teaching them a human game called hide and seek, which Liz had already mastered so well that she had once hidden for 3 hours before anyone found her. The palace guards were stationed outside the nursery door, far enough away to give the children privacy. The creature came through a ventilation shaft. It was a fire serpent from the volcanic wastes, longer than Nora was tall, covered in scales that burned hot enough to melt stone. It should not have been able to enter the palace. Someone had brought it in deliberately and released it into the nursery. The serpent struck at Solon first. Nora threw herself forward and knocked the hatchling aside. The serpent's fangs missed him by centimeters. She grabbed a piece of metal from the floor and swung at the creature's head, buying time for the children to react. She did not call for the guards. There was no time. The serpent was fast, and if it got past her, the hatchlings would be in danger. Instead, Nora started giving orders. Pyrrhus was to aim for the eyes. Her fire was precise enough to blind the creature without hitting anyone else. Solon was to wait until the serpent was distracted, then strike from behind with his full strength. Liz was to stay back and watch for any other threats. They had practiced coordinated activities before. This was just another challenge. The hatchlings responded instantly. Pyrrhus unleashed a focused stream of fire at the serpent's face. The creature recoiled, hissing in pain. Solon charged from the side and slammed into the serpent's body, driving it against the wall. Nora kept its attention focused on her, dodging strikes and keeping herself between the creature and Liz. The fight lasted 2 minutes. It felt like hours. The serpent finally retreated toward the ventilation shaft, badly burned and battered. As it fled, its tail whipped around in a final desperate attack. It was aimed at Liz. Nora did not think. She simply moved. Her body blocked the strike that would have hit the smallest hatchling. The impact threw her across the room. She hit the wall and did not get up. The hatchlings went berserk. Pyrrhus screamed in a frequency that brought guards running from across the palace. Solon threw himself at the serpent with enough force to kill it outright. Liz ran to Nora and stood over her fallen body, breathing fire at anyone who came too close. When Captain Ress burst through the door, all 3 children positioned themselves around the unconscious human, refusing to let anyone near her. Pyrrhus spoke in broken common, her voice shaking with rage and fear. She said the human belonged to them now. Anyone who tried to take her would burn. Emperor Dravos arrived moments later. He found his children protecting a servant, something that went against every Vithrani tradition. They should have fled to safety. They should have called for adults to handle the situation. Instead, they had fought alongside their caretaker and were now guarding her body like she was one of their own. He knelt beside Nora and checked for signs of life. She was breathing, badly injured but alive. When he tried to lift her, Liz growled at him. Her own father, the emperor of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. She was warning him not to hurt her human. Dravos looked at his youngest child with something he had not felt in years: pride. His children had finally found something worth protecting. He ordered the best physicians in the empire to save the human's life. When an advisor asked why he cared so much about a mere servant, Dravos answered that she was not a servant. She was the first person his children had chosen to protect. That made her family. Nora opened her eyes to find 3 small faces hovering above her. The medical wing was quiet except for the soft hum of healing equipment. Bandages covered her arms and torso. Everything hurt in a distant way that suggested heavy painkillers were doing their job. Liz burst into tears the moment Nora moved. Real tears this time, not the practiced kind she used to manipulate adults. The little hatchling had been sitting beside the bed for 4 days, refusing food, refusing sleep, threatening to burn any medical staff who tried to move her. Pyrrhus and Solon had been equally stubborn. The physicians had eventually given up trying to enforce visiting hours. Nora tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Pyrrhus immediately held a cup of water to her lips, careful not to spill despite her shaking claws. Solon arranged pillows behind her head with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who could punch through walls. Liz climbed onto the bed and curled against Nora's side, her small body warm with internal fire. A physician entered and stopped short at the scene. The royal heirs of the Vithrani Empire were caring for a human like she was one of their clutch. He checked Nora's vital signs and informed her that she had suffered 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, and internal bruising. She would need weeks to recover fully. The children had not left her side since she was brought in. Nora asked what happened to the serpent. Pyrrhus told her Solon had killed it. She said this with obvious pride. Solon ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise but pleased. Liz added that she had protected Nora until help arrived. She had not let anyone touch her human, not even father. The door opened again. Emperor Dravos entered, and Nora tried to sit up straighter out of respect. He waved away her effort and took a seat beside the bed. His ancient eyes studied her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. He told her the attack had been arranged by Lord Cavros and his allies. They had been arrested. Their houses had been stripped of titles. The penalty for attempting to harm the royal heirs was death, but Dravos had chosen exile instead. He did not want his children's first memory of justice to be an execution. Nora thanked him. She started to say something about being grateful for the medical care, but Dravos stopped her. He had not come to discuss politics. He had come because his children had refused to leave her bedside, and he wanted to understand why. For the first time, the Emperor of the Vithrani spoke honestly. His mate had died giving birth to Liz. He had buried his grief in duty, throwing himself into ruling the empire while servants raised his children. He had told himself they did not need him. They had everything they could want. They were safe and fed and educated. What more could they require? But children needed more than safety. They needed connection. They needed someone who would stay, and Dravos had not stayed. He had left them with strangers who could not understand them, and his children had responded by driving every stranger away. Nora listened without judgment. She understood loss. Her own parents had died when she was young, and she had raised her siblings on a farm with no money and no help. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned by circumstance if not by intention. She told Dravos that his children did not need perfect parents. They just needed present ones. They needed him to show up, to be in the room, to let them know he was not going to leave. She could teach him what she had learned if he wanted to learn it. The emperor of the most powerful empire in the galaxy sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked how to begin. Nora suggested he start by reading them a story. Pyrrhus loved stories about brave warriors. Solon preferred tales with lots of action. Liz liked anything with clever tricksters. He should sit on the floor with them because it made him seem less intimidating. He should let them interrupt with questions because that meant they were engaged. Dravos looked at his children. Pyrrhus was watching him with cautious hope. Solon was trying to look indifferent but failing. Liz was pretending to be asleep against Nora's side, but her ears were tilted toward her father. The ancient ruler stood. He asked Pyrrhus to choose a book from the shelf in the corner. She selected one carefully and brought it to him. He sat on the floor, his massive frame folding awkwardly into a position he had not used in decades. His children gathered around him. Liz stayed pressed against Nora but turned to watch. Dravos began to read. His voice was rough at first, uncertain. He stumbled over words meant for children's ears, but he kept going. And slowly his children moved closer. Solon leaned against his arm. Pyrrhus rested her head on his knee. Liz finally left Nora's side and crawled into her father's lap. Nora watched them through heavy eyes. The painkillers were pulling her toward sleep, but before she drifted off, she heard Pyrrhus speak clearly. "Stay forever," the little dragon told her father. "Stay forever." 6 months after the attack, The Galactic Union called an emergency session. Representatives from 47 species filled the council chamber on Nexus Station, their voices overlapping in a dozen languages. The agenda had only one item: the growing influence of a human over the Vithrani royal family. Reports had spread across the galaxy. The feared Vithrani Empire, known for conquest and fire, was changing. Trade negotiations had become more flexible. Border disputes were being resolved through diplomacy rather than threats. And at the center of this transformation was a human nurse who had somehow become essential to the imperial household. Some species saw opportunity, others saw danger. A human, soft and fragile, wielding influence over the galaxy's most powerful military force. It was unprecedented. It was concerning. It had to be addressed. Emperor Dravos entered the council chamber with his 3 children at his side. The hatchlings walked with perfect posture, their claws clicking on the polished floor. They were dressed in formal robes of deep crimson. They did not fidget or whisper or misbehave. The counselors who had heard stories about the ungovernable royal heirs stared in disbelief. The Krellian ambassador spoke first. She demanded that the human caretaker be replaced with someone from an established species. Humans were too primitive, too emotional, too strange. Their influence on young minds could not be trusted. Dravos invited Nora to address the council herself. She walked to the speaking platform in a simple uniform, no armor, no weapons. She was smaller than almost every being in the chamber. The counselors loomed over her like mountains surrounding a single tree. Nora spoke simply. She explained that humans came from a world that tried to kill them every day. Their planet had crushing gravity, violent storms, and millions of creatures evolved specifically to hunt and kill. Humans should have died out long ago. They survived because they learned to form bonds with the very things that threatened them. She told them about wolves again, about horses, about elephants and dolphins. She explained that humans did not conquer their companions. They earned trust. They showed up consistently. They proved through patience and presence that they would not leave. The Vithrani children had needed someone who would not leave. That was all. They were not monsters. They were not broken. They were grieving children who had lost their mother and been abandoned by their father. They had tested everyone who came near them, and everyone had failed, until a human decided to stay. A counselor interrupted. He said the human was merely a clever manipulator. She had wormed her way into a position of power through deception. Liz stepped forward. She was barely 3 years old, the smallest being in the chamber. She spoke in perfect common, her words clear and confident. She said Nora had taught them that strength meant protecting others, not burning them. She said Nora had shown them that being brave meant staying when others ran away. She said Nora had never tried to control them or change them. She had just been there, every day, no matter what they did. The council fell silent. A Vithrani princess, born to fire and conquest, was speaking about compassion as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Pyrrhus spoke next. She said humans were not weak. They were impossibly strong in ways that Vithrani had never understood. They could walk into a room full of creatures that could kill them and sit down and eat lunch. They could look at a predator and see a friend. They could take something dangerous and love it until it became family. Solon finished. He said simply that Nora had saved his life. She had thrown herself between him and death without hesitation. That made her pack. That made her theirs. Anyone who tried to take her would have to go through all 3 of them. The council chamber erupted in murmurs. Emperor Dravos raised one hand, and silence fell. He announced that Nora Webb had been granted permanent residence in the Vithrani Empire. She had been given the title of Royal Guardian, with all the rights and protections that entailed. She was family. The matter was not open for discussion. 3 months later, other species began quietly inquiring about human caretakers. The Felrani embassy asked first. Their young were prone to anxiety attacks. Humans, apparently, were excellent at providing calm presence during crisis. The Boraki followed. Their children's paralysis defense made them difficult to handle. Humans, it turned out, could be temporarily paralyzed and simply wake up and continue working as if nothing had happened. Nora trained the first generation of human xenobiological caregivers herself. She taught them what she had learned on Ashfall. Do not try to dominate or submit. Just be present, be consistent, be unimpressed by danger and unlimited in patience. Show up every day, stay when others leave. On her last night in the nursery before moving to a larger role in the palace, Nora tucked the three hatchlings into their beds. They had grown in the past year. Pyrrhus was nearly as tall as Nora now. Solon could lift furniture she could barely push. Lys had learned to manipulate adults so effectively that she had once convinced a visiting ambassador to give her his ceremonial hat. Pyrrhus asked if Nora would stay forever. Nora said she would stay as long as they wanted her. Solon asked what if they wanted her forever. Nora kissed his scaled forehead and promised that forever was exactly what they would get. Emperor Dravos watched from the doorway. His children had taught him how to love again. A human had taught them how to be loved. He nodded once to Nora, a gesture of respect between equals. Across the galaxy, a new listing appeared on employment boards. Human specialist, xenobiological childcare. The pay was excellent. The danger was extreme. The applications from Earth numbered in the thousands. Humans would always find something dangerous to love.